Well, Frank, it's nice to be here with you today. I'm glad I had this opportunity. You said in your Nobel acceptance speech that you personally are a product of both the harmony and conflict between China and the West. Can you tell me what you meant by that, looking especially back to your early years, how the history of that time led up to your introduction to science and math?
You know that China had a very long and distinguished history, but by the 19th century, China was in a very sad state. There was no modern science at all. And big, great powers, mostly Great Britain, had tried to carve up China. And then there was a war in 1900 called the Boxer War, and during which 8 armies, including some armies from the United States, occupied Beijing and signed a treaty. The treaty stipulated that China was to pay 450 million taels, that means ounces of silver, an astronomical amount at that time. In about 10 years or so after that, the US Congress passed a law which said that part of that, the American share of that 450 million taels of silver is to be returned to China for educational purposes. And a foundation was set up, and the money from the foundation was used for 2 purposes. One, to establish a university in China, which is called Tsinghua University, one of the most famous universities now. It's one of the earliest modern university in China. I was a direct beneficiary of that because my father was a professor of that university since 1929, and I grew up on that campus. Another part of the money was used to establish scholarships for Chinese students to come to America to study, and I won one of those scholarships. So in 1945, I came and became a graduate student in Chicago. So in 1957, when I stood in front of the King of Sweden and the assembled people, I was moved to reflect on my own history in the context of the history of China and the relationship between China and the West. So that's why I said that I was a product of both cultures in conflict and in harmony.
In your early years, you said you wrote in your selected papers book, as I recall, you had a tranquil childhood, which was already a privilege, I suppose, in that time. Eventually, however, the war arrived and touched your life and brought you to the Southwest
Associated University, yes.
Can you comment about that? What opportunities were there for you in these very difficult times?
I was very, very fortunate. When I was an elementary school student and a high school student, most of the children my age did not have enough to eat, did not have enough clothing. China was in an extremely sad state. It's when you look at some of the movies about people in Africa today, I think that's the order of magnitude of the state that the Chinese children mostly were in at that time. But because my father was a professor, Tsinghua University had a gate It's had a fence, and so inside of the fence we live a completely different life from most of the kids my age at that time. So I was able to get a very good elementary school education and high school education. But all during those years, Japan was making inroads into China. First, Japan got Manchukuo, which is northeastern China. Then in 1937, they tried to occupy Beijing. So the whole university moved to the southwest, and that's where I went to college from 38 to 42. The trek from Beijing to Kunming was a long and arduous one. And millions of people moved south. So it was a very, very sad state. But at the university, however, perhaps because everybody, both the staff and the students, felt that during such difficult times, it was possible to do some scholarly research and learning. One must treasure every moment of it. That may be one of the reasons that many of my classmates, my university mates, later became very important scholars, both in China and in America. So I, in some sense, was very, very fortunate under these very difficult circumstances. Somehow, I was able to have a academically oriented background throughout my elementary school, high school, and university days.
You wrote in the selected papers about, well, we were somewhat out of date. The journals would arrive a few years late when you were
Yes.
in the Southwest Associated, but they arrived.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of that there was a sense of being connected to the outside scholarly world despite everything?
Yes. I had earlier referred to my father. My father was sort of the first generation of Chinese scholars who got PhDs abroad, who introduced, after they returned to China, modern science to the next generation. So by the time that I went to the Southwest Associated University, China was in some sense, at least in that small corner, well connected with the outside world. So the courses I took in that university were completely up to date. In fact, I took a course of quantum mechanics. After 46, I took the same course at Chicago. Chicago at that time was one of the most, the greatest physics departments. And I found that the course I took in quantum mechanics in China was education-wise much better than the one taught in Chicago, partly because the one taught at Chicago was taught by Edward Teller. Now, Edward Teller was a brilliant physicist, but he was too busy. He didn't have enough time to prepare the lectures, so he got stuck in class periodically. But reflecting on that, I found that experience of Taylor getting stuck very educational. It's because of the following. Since I already knew quantum mechanics, so when he got stuck, I could observe how he was trying to get out of that, that bad situation. And then that taught me something. I realized to Taylor what is important, what is not important. So that was also very educational for me.
Well, the commitment to higher education in very difficult times, to say difficult economic times, is of course understating it tremendously, is maybe a lesson that we can learn here in the United States in these much less difficult times, relatively speaking. Now, you referred to the course you took in quantum mechanics at Chicago, but you came to Chicago through New York. As I recall, you took a boat through India up into New York, and when you arrived in New York, as I understand it, you were searching for Fermi.
Yes.
Could you tell us the story of how you came to Chicago from whichever pier you landed on?
When I was in Kunming during my university days there, I really had a very good foundation about modern physics. In particular, I already developed a certain taste. And the modern physicists that I most admired were Einstein, Dirac, and Fermi. All three of them were great physicists of the 20th century. Now, Einstein didn't have that many graduate students. Besides, he was very old by the time that I arrived in America. So he was out as a possible thesis advisor. Dirac also didn't take many graduate students, and he was in England anyway. And Fermi was the one that I very much admired, and I wanted to be his graduate student. So when I arrived in New York, I arrived in New York and not in San Francisco, because that was the end of the war. There were no commercial traffic between China and the U.S. The only way to come to U.S. For me was to get a berth on one of the troop transports, which were sent. They are called Liberty ships. They were about 5,000 tons each, and they would transport something like 3,000 American soldiers from the China, Burma, India theater back to the United States. So I got one of those berths in Calcutta, and the ship took us through the Red Seas, the Mediterranean. So I landed in New York. I remember there was a person in New York. I won a scholarship, and there was a person who manages that scholarship in New York, and he rented rooms in Edson Hotel, which still exists in Times Square. I took Fan Fan there one day recently and sat in the lobby. It's full of Art Deco styles. After one day, I went to Columbia. I took the subway to Columbia and went to the Pupin lab, trying to look for Fermi. But the secretaries of the department didn't know who Fermi was. I was really surprised because it turns out that Fermi had been absent doing classified work. Those secretaries were new, so they didn't know about him. So I was very disappointed. So the next day I went to Princeton, and I did see Wigner. But he said he was going to be on leave for half a year at the Oak Ridge. So he couldn't be my thesis advisor. Then he said, how about you're working with Wheeler, with John Wheeler? So I went to see Wheeler. I don't know whether you have met Wheeler. Wheeler was, he just died, I think 2 years ago at the age of approximately 100. Wheeler, you know, is a very serious person. He really make any jokes. And when I saw him, he gave me a list of some 10 items which he gives to graduate students, which were topics that he thought would be useful to do research on. I remember some of those still. One of them was to find which of the experiments which said the mass of the meson was 50, the electron mass, 200 the electron mass. There was a spectrum of them. And one problem was to study and decide which one is the most reliable one. Another was about the geophysical effect on the cosmic ray. Those were all very interesting problems, and many years later, I could not help but wondering if I had stayed as a graduate student of Wheeler, what would happen afterwards. But anyway, while I was still debating whether I should remain in Princeton as Wheeler student, I heard that Fermi had decided to go to Chicago. So I quickly cabled the University of Chicago for admissions. And my grades were very good in China. So they cabled back within 1 week, saying that they accepted me. That's how I became a student in Chicago.
So, but there it was Teller who was actually your advisor, at least in some formal sense. Is that
Yes.
right? Although you worked in a lab
Yes.
for a while.
The reason is because on the way to China, to America, I said to myself that I had learned a lot of theory, but I had no experience doing experiments. So I decided I should write an experimental thesis. So when I got to Chicago, when I saw Fermi, in fact, I arrived in Chicago a few days before New Year's Day, 1946. That was also approximately the time that Fermi arrived from Los Alamos. And so I went to see him. I said I wanted to do experiments with him. I had very strong recommendation letters. So he was willing to entertain that. But after some investigation, he said it couldn't be done because he was doing experiments in argon, and argon was classified completely at that time. So he suggested that he made two suggestions. One, I would work with Edward Teller on theory, because he said Teller has many, many ideas, many, many graduate students. And another suggestion was that if I want to do experiments, I could work with Sam Allison, who is an nuclear experimental physicist, who was in fact Oppenheimer's deputy at Los Alamos. And so I first went to study with Teller. Teller was a brilliant physicist, and also in person, he was a very warm person. So he sort of immediately embraced me and gave me several problems. I worked on them, but Taylor's approach to physics and my approach to physics are not quite the same. He is more willing to make approximations. I'm less willing to make approximations. This, different styles of approach to physics. So I learned a lot from him, but none of the problems he assigned to me produced a paper. So I went to work with Allison. I worked in Allison's laboratory for about 20 months. And that was very educational for me, because I learned that I'm not born to be an experimental physicist. I was clumsy in the laboratory, and all my fellow graduate students laughed at me for my doing all kinds of wrong things. But they liked me as a person, especially because I can solve theoretical problems for them. So we were on very good terms. And then come 1948, this was 20 months after I became Allison student, my experiment was doing very poorly. I was very famous in Chicago at that time. You can imagine, because there were not that many Chinese students in America at that time, not like now. And here comes a very thin Chinese student who seems to be doing extremely well. In fact, not to be bashful, I beat all of my fellow graduate students hands down. So they all knew that this Chinese graduate student is having great troubles doing experiments. So one day Taylor came to the lab and said, Frank, I understand you are not doing well in your experiment. I said, yes. He said, you had written a short paper. I found it to be very good in theory. Why don't you just fill it out so that it becomes longer, and I would accept that as your PhD thesis. That produced a strong emotion on my part. So I thanked him and said, thank you. I have to think about this. So I thought about it for 2 days and decided he was right. I finally understood I should not try to be an experimental physicist. So I went back to him, and he said, fine, but it's a bit too short for a thesis. Can you make it longer? So I went back and added 2 pages to it. Many years later, Taylor, at one of my birthday celebrations, said, this went several versions, several times, and eventually it reached the 11 pages, and he decided there's no more use arguing with me, so he accepted that. So that became a very short thesis. But the thesis was very good, and in retrospect, the thesis was using symmetry and group theory about nuclear reactions. That turns out to be the main general theme of much of my subsequent work. For some reason, as a graduate student, I like the concept of symmetry. I like the mathematical formulation of the concept of symmetry as applied to natural phenomena. That became one of the main themes, or perhaps the main theme of my subsequent work.
I believe while still at Chicago, you did eventually write a paper with Fermi.
Yes.
About the possible composite nature of the mesons.
Yes.
And at the beginning of that paper, you and he remark that as the number of so-called elementary particles increases, the chances that they are truly elementary decrease. Yeah. Words to that effect. How did that paper come about? And in some sense, it anticipates a great deal of work in the subsequent years.
The main idea was Fermi's. And at that time, people sort of accepted many of these new particles as elementary particles. Fermi said to me, this may not be true. Why don't we study whether the meson could be composite? So we began to collaborate on that. I remember that was in the summer of 1949, and Fermi's family was, I think, in Italy or someplace. So Fermi was a bachelor, so we spent a lot of time together. And so I learned, I've taken Fermi's courses and had attended his special courses, evening courses, and learned the style of Fermi about how to approach physics. But this collaboration became a very close contact. After we did some calculations, I thought that the question was interesting, but I didn't feel that what we said could be verified experimentally. So I was not proposing that we would publish it. But Fermi said, no, we should publish it. He said, I remember distinctly. He said, as a student, you learn problems set by other people. As a researcher, you should set the questions yourselves. So we may not have hit the right composition, but just raising the question is important. So we published a paper.
Well, another paper that you commented on thinking about whether it would be published or not, although in this case the answer was simple, was the paper with Mills on gauge theories. Now, looking back from here, the time from your arrival to the time of that paper, which was 1954, if I remember right, is not so long from this perspective. Can you give some trace of how it developed, how it came to fruition?
I think I was very, very fortunate. I had earlier referred to the fact that the paper I wrote for my PhD thesis under Teller was about using symmetry, the concept of symmetry, and group theory in mathematics to apply it to natural phenomena. For some reason, that was something that I already, when I was in China, was very much interested in. I was very fortunate that I got onto this track, or this particular aspect of the structure of physical laws that early. So when I was a graduate student in Chicago, beyond that paper that I just referred to about, which became my thesis, I studied the question of symmetry. And in particular, one important mathematical expression of symmetry was called gauge symmetry, or gauge invariance, which was invented by a great mathematician named Hermann Weyl in 1918. I was hooked on that idea. So as a graduate student, I scribbled some notes. And these notes I found a few years ago in my papers. And so they have now been republished. If you read those notes, you see that I was trying to say maybe this gauge symmetry idea could be used to generate a theory of how these elementary particles would interact with each other, what forces they exert on each other. So that key idea I already had. But to implement that, I got stuck. So I would work on it for a few days and abandon it. But then after 2 years, there were more elementary particles found. There were more desire to study how they relate to each other, how they interact with each other. So I would come back to this idea and then got stuck again with the implementation. This took place several times until 1953, 54. In 53, I was already at the Institute for Advanced Studies for several years, and the Brookhaven National Laboratory had a new, the world's largest accelerator at that time called Cosmotron, just beginning to operate. They want to get some young theorists to help the experimentalists there. So they asked me to visit Brookhaven for 1 year, 53 to 54, which I did. And they assigned a small office for me and they assigned the office mate, and that turned out to be Bob Mills. Bob Mills was some 4 or 5 years younger than I, and he was just about to get his PhD, and he got a job as a sort of a pre-PhD postdoc at Brookhaven. So we shared the office. And of course, we began to talk about the various aspects of physics. I found him to be very intelligent and with wide-ranging interests. So naturally, we began to discuss this unfinished idea about how to use gauge symmetry to create interactions between particles. And then we got stuck at the same place. When Bob and I, years later, recalled, we were both vague about what precisely happened. But we said, apparently, that the reason that it doesn't work is because a fundamental formula which we copied from Maxwell may need some amendment. So let's add a term to it and see what happens. We added a quadratic term. At the time we said, if the quadratic term still does not work, we'll add a cubic term. But fortunately, when we added the quadratic term, after a couple of days of calculation, not very long, today we can teach to the graduate students in 1 hour. We found that all the difficulties disappear. All this very complicated formula, which became longer and longer, all cancel each other out, so that we got a very beautiful, compact equation. So we knew we got something. Then there was a long struggle because the idea was beautiful. The structure was very beautiful. But how do you compare that with experiments? And there was one major problem which we couldn't solve, namely, according to what we structured, it was a set of equations. It apparently gives 0 mass particles, lots of them. But there were no such 0 mass particles to be found. So that was a big obstacle. In fact, in February 1954, while Mills and I were still doing this, Oppenheimer, back in Princeton, heard about it. And also, Pauli was visiting Princeton, and Pauli was interested in the idea. So Oppenheimer called me up and said, Frank, why don't you come back to Princeton and give a seminar on what you're doing? So I did. And at the seminar, Pauli gave me a hard time because he was interested in it, and he also knew that the idea would produce massless particles, which were not experimentally found. So he kept on raising this question. So I had described that experience in my selected papers. After that, for some 4 months, Mills and I tried to solve this problem. We couldn't. But we felt that the idea was very beautiful. So we wrote a paper. At the end of the paper, there was a paragraph discussing this particular question. Why are there massless particles? Why we apparently were creating a theory with massless particles which were not experimentally found. That section was very difficult to write because we didn't know what the solution was. But today, with hindsight, if you read that section, what it essentially says is that there cannot be massless particles. So there must be something in addition, which we do not know. So we ended the paragraph in that note. I think in retrospect, we were smarter in this case compared with Pauli, because Pauli confronted the same question, and he became discouraged, and he never published anything about it. At that time, the editor was Gouchmint. We sent in our paper for publication. No questions were really asked. He accepted it without any questions, so within 2 or 3 months, it was published. Of course, now it has become very important paper because later on there were additional ideas, very important ideas, called the symmetry breaking, which became very successful starting in the 1970s.
Well, in that period between the mid-50s and 1970 already is 15 years, I don't think, the paper was certainly not unknown, but it was considered, I remember even as a student hearing, it was considered somewhat mysterious. When did you become aware that these theories were emerging as the theories of what's now called the Standard Model? When did it become clear, and did you have some faith that this eventually might occur?
It was a gradual process. If you ask, when is it generally accepted that this idea is correct, after you add this symmetry breaking idea to it, that really was in 1972. So all between 54 to the 70s, what happened was, for example, our paper was published in 54. Nobody ever invited me to give a talk in the next 10 years about the subject. I did give a talk at Harvard, but what happened was Harvard was looking for a young professor. So they were interviewing various people, so I was one of them. But they didn't assign a topic for me to talk. They just say, we want you to come and give a seminar. You name the title. So we talked about this. I remember that I talked to a large audience, and at the end of that, there was not a single question asked. In the audience, there was Ramsey, there was Schwinger, there were many people from MIT. I think the general view was that the idea is very beautiful, but it has nothing to do with physics.
What year, do you recall the year?
That talk was in 54.
Oh, it was, right then.
Yes. Now, after that, as I said, nobody ever invited me or Bob to give a talk on the subject. But then about 7 or 8 years later, I think in late 50s, Murray Gell-Mann somehow became interested, and he generalized what we did to a bigger symmetry. But of course, that paper also did not immediately materialize as something agreeing with experiment. The Russians got onto it also around 1960, because I was sent a Russian book, which is a collection of papers about related to the subject, which shows that by the early 1960s, there were scattered people in the Soviet Union who found the idea interesting. So there were several papers, in fact, there were many papers written, but some of them were collected in this little book. The crucial development which made gauge theory important was first because of a paper in 1967 by Steve Weinberg. Steve Weinberg said that if you marry the gauge idea with symmetry breaking in a specific context, the problem with symmetry breaking is that it's not unique. Gauge theory is quite unique. Symmetry breaking is not unique. He said that he proposed one particular version of symmetry breaking and said that this might work. In addition, he predicted, predicted is too strong a word. He sort of said, perhaps the whole theory is renormalizable. Renormalization is an important requirement for any theory of this type. And he did not prove that it's renormalizable. But he sort of guessed that it might be renormalizable. That renormalizability was proven in 1971 or 72 by a young graduate student in Netherlands. And also at the same time, experiments began to show that this combination of gauge theory with symmetry breaking produced some experiments which were found to be correct. So starting about in the early 1970s, two things. One, these experiments. The other is the renormalizability pushed the idea forward. And then it became sort of a idea which dominated the field. And amazingly, since that time, with thousands of complicated and beautiful experiments, more or less the original idea of Weinberg's combination, Weinberg's choice of how to do symmetry breaking seems to agree with all experiments. What's the lesson that one should learn from this? Is that I would say, A, one should explore beautiful ideas. B, one should not be deterred if one beautiful idea does not solve all problems. C, I think editors should not be too harsh on people who write exploratory ideas.
Generally, in that time, both before the early 70s and after this creation of the modern theory that uses, of elementary particles, that uses gauge, non-abelian gauge theories, you left the applications to elementary particles in general to others. You concentrate, as we'll talk about, in the mathematical structure. But it indicates, well, it's a personal choice. Maybe you'll comment on why you didn't get involved so much in what we now sometimes describe as model building.
I think that's a very complicated question because that involves psychology. You know that every research worker has certain likes, certain dislikes. When Weinberg was doing the 1967 paper, what was my attitude to it? In retrospect, I should have rushed and explore whether the idea is correct and whether it should be modified or so on and so forth. I didn't do it. And not only that, in some sense I was opposed to it. I was opposed to it partly for some philosophical reasons, which in fact I had detailed in my selected papers. But also, here it reflects on something which I think the general public may not sufficiently appreciate. Because every research worker has a certain style. And if somebody else proposes a style that is not exactly along his lines, there's a natural resistance to it. The resistance, in retrospect, may be totally irrational, but it's psychologically very natural. So part of the reason that I did not further explore that symmetry breaking, part of it was based on some general philosophical ideas. Part of it was the psychological element. Actually, there's a third. Because at that time, I was heavily engaged in many body problems, statistical mechanics. I was making big headways in it. So therefore, I did not spare time back into this area. But I think that young research workers should be aware of the fact that your emotional reaction to what you like and what you do not like is a fact of life. You should be aware of it. I would not say that you should abandon that, because if you have some resistance to something, that may be in fact the right thing to resist. It's in the frontiers. This is a little bit like fashion, women's fashion. You may have a new idea about fashion, which may or may not blossom. And you have to realize that both you must insist on your own ideas, and yet you have to realize that your direction may not be the right one. This is a complicated process.
It was a metaphor I wasn't anticipating. In the intervening times, with the successes of the Standard Model, people have talked once again about an idea that's so often associated with Einstein, the idea of sometimes called a final theory. Of course, string theory and its variants have been widely investigated in that connection. So what are your thoughts about this idea of finding a fundamental theory upon which we're unlikely ever to advance or to improve?
Perhaps the greatest and the most original idea of Einstein. Einstein did many things, many beautiful things, many important things. But perhaps the most original of his ideas was the creation of general relativity. And after he created general relativity, you might say that Einstein has changed. This has been commented upon. He realized that, in his own words, you can understand nature by pure thought. And along that direction, he then wanted to create a unified field theory. Unified field theory is the final theory that some people refer to, sometimes called theory of everything. Now, with the gauge idea, with the symmetry breaking, of the four fundamental forces of nature, three of them have become well understood through this combination of gauge theory and symmetry breaking. But the one last one, gravity, which was what Einstein had worked on originally, remain not tractable. It's not tractable because if you marry general relativity or gravity with quantum mechanics, you get into a mess. It's not well understood. And that is what prompted people to launch the idea of string theory. Now, string theory has been in existence for at least 30 years now. It has, in some sense, created a new sub-discipline. In the last 30 years, if you look at the most important research departments in physics all over the world, and look at the graduate students, the best graduate students, best theory graduate students from these universities, I do not know the statistics. I would say 50% of them are now in string theory. That very fact says that it is intellectually challenging. It is intellectually interesting. Otherwise, you could not entice thousands of these bright young people into it. And yet, it's not materialized. Not only it has not materialized into something which experimentally has been verified, it cannot even produce a statement for the experimentalists to say that you test this and you will be able to tell me whether my theory is correct. It has still, in some sense, an amorphous state. My experience with physics, just the last 50 years of experience, tells me that it's not likely, let's say, in the next 50 years, that what has been done in string theory so far would enter into fundamental physics. I think that's very unlikely. But on the other hand, it has created a lot of excitement by the mathematicians. Now, one of the great mathematicians today is Atiyah of Great Britain. And he told me that not only has string theory produced things which are very important in mathematics, it has taught the mathematicians a lesson, namely that for many years, mathematicians emphasize rigor. But they now realize that these string theorists do not adhere to strict rigor, and yet they can produce things which were unthinkable to the mathematician to start with. But once pointed out, they found after some detour that in fact those are rigorously establishable. So that means that string theory is now a kind of a new subdiscipline, which so far the top mathematicians think is an important development, and they want to explore it further. So that is my opinion about string theory.
In the attractiveness of string theory to mathematicians, do you think there's a sign that it has passed a test of mathematical beauty, as opposed, which might be different than beauty for physicists or physics?
String theory goes beyond the 4 dimensions. And geometry and mathematics of higher dimensions is extremely intricate and very beautiful. And apparently, I'm not in the field, but according to my mathematician friend, some of these explorations using physicists' intuition has produced non-rigorous mathematical results, which later turned out to be rigorously provable by mathematicians. Some of these have surprised them in their depth and, in some sense, strange beauty. apparently one idea, which according to Tia, in a conversation with me, was that there were two kinds of mathematical structures, which to the mathematicians are totally unrelated to each other. And the string physicists produced non-rigorous statement which said that the two are deeply related to each other. They are dual to each other, whatever that word dual means. And that shocked the mathematicians. And when they realized that, in fact, that statement is correct, via a rigorous route, they gained tremendous respect for what the string theorists are doing today.
To go back to the 1950s, not long after your, of course, landmark paper with Mills, those years saw your electrifying discovery with T.D. Lee that symmetry between left hand and right hand is not universally respected by the laws of nature. In fact, it is by some, but not by others. So you described, well, a couple of things about that. You described in your selected papers a conference where Feynman posed an important question, Rochester Conference, I think it was called. So were Lee and you ever concerned about competition, that, oh, we're almost there, somebody else will get the idea first?
Oh, there was an intense competition because the whole high-energy physics community, which was the frontier thing in the 50s in physics, were focused on that question. Our foremost competitor was Murray Gell-Mann. And in fact, for example, we had an idea before the famous paper of Lee and me. We had an idea called parity doublet, which Murray Gell-Mann also had. There were many people with many ideas. So there was a competition, but actually not Feynman. Feynman was not in the field. He was, in some sense, an intruder in the field. And if you read this popular book, this bestseller called You Must Be Joking, Mr. Feynman, you read that his sister told him that you are not in this field. You either have to study hard to get into it or don't say anything about it, something like this. Now, at that time, nobody believed that the right-left symmetry can be violated. Why? I would say, there's an aesthetic feeling. Everybody likes something to be beautifully symmetrical. B, there were experiments, especially there were many non-accurate experiments which showed right-left are quite symmetrical. And in experiments related to chemistry, related to biology, the physical laws are always exactly symmetrical. And in addition, about the new kind of phenomena that came into physicists' attention in the 20th century, namely radioactivity, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments which showed that right-left are symmetrical. So therefore, by 1956, everybody said, you are crazy if you think that the right-left can be not symmetrical. And since everybody was working it, so Lee and I naturally were working hard on that. And we had some proposals about how to solve this contradiction called the theta-tau puzzle, which is related to the question of right-left symmetry. We did not a priori say right-left should be not exactly symmetrical. What we did was through a detailed analysis of these hundreds of beta decay experiments, that in fact, everybody had an illusion that those experiments proved in those experiments right and left are symmetrical. What we did was, through an examination of these detailed experiments, there were hundreds of some 4 or 5 different types. None of them, in fact, had anything to do with whether right and left are symmetrical or not. That is really the crux of what we did. So then we wrote a paper saying that if it's the equivalent saying that if you believe that right and left are symmetrical in beta decay, you should realize that that is based on no real experiments. People just were thinking too rapidly and thought these hundreds of experiments had proved the right-left symmetry. In fact, they do not prove it. This is our discovery. But beyond that, we then said, okay, if these experiments do not examine right-left symmetry, are there experiments that can tell whether right and left symmetry? Yes. So we proposed some 4 or 5 different experiments and said that these are the experiments that you should do to test whether in beta decay right and left are symmetrical. And none of them has been done yet. Did we believe that if one of these is done, it will prove right-left non-symmetrical? No.
My next question. Yeah.
No, we didn't believe that.
Really?
In fact, I can prove that we didn't believe it. Because after we submitted our paper in the summer of 1956, we immediately launched a detailed investigation with many about the problem, which has nothing with this problem. It's clear that if we had guessed that these experiments showed right-left non-symmetrical, that would be a revolution, and we would certainly concentrate on that and shelve those statistical mechanics problems. So that in the next half a year, we were mainly doing statistical mechanics is a very good proof that we didn't believe right-left can be non-symmetrical. Therefore, when Ms. Wu and her collaborators announced their result, it was a great shock to everybody, especially us.
Could you sleep that night?
Pardon?
Could you sleep that night?
Actually, it's a little bit more dragged out because around Christmas, 1956, Ms. Wu called from Washington. Her experiment was done in collaboration with a group of people at the Bureau of Standards, which was in Washington. She called from Washington and said that we believe that right-left is not exactly symmetrical. But she, being a very careful person, she said, don't tell anybody this. We are going to check. And after checking, we are going to make the formal announcement. So I hung up. Within a few hours, I got a call from Berkeley, which said, have you heard? I said, what? So it's clear that the news could not be kept. But they did check, and after about 10 days, they made a formal statement saying that the right-left is not exactly symmetrical, which was, I would say, in my long experience as a physicist, the 2 greatest sudden big excitement were 2. This was the first one. And the second one was the 1987 one about the high temperature superconductivity.
So the paper on parity violation, or the possibility or the test thereof, was a collaboration with T.D. Lee. And as you pointed out, it was only one of a number of a series of great advances that you made in collaboration with Lee. This was maybe the signature collaboration of your career, but it came to an abrupt end a few years later. Can you comment on that situation, on your how you think about this all these years later?
In the 1950s, Lee and I were very famous as a team. I had later written that our collaboration was admired and envied. And indeed, that was true. Up to that time, there were no friction between us at all. But I think our great fame, first with the 1957 announcement by Ms. Wu that parity is not conserved, and second with the award of the Nobel Prize to Lee and myself later that year, produced a new element in our relationship. So that finally in 1962, we broke up. It was a very, very traumatic experience, both for me and for T.D. Lee. So after that, we are not in communication with each other. Now, especially because of our prominence in science, we became very famous in China. Lee and I were the first two Nobel Prize winners of Chinese descent. And the Chinese people were very proud of us. So therefore, I remembered when in 1971 I visited China for the new China for the first time. Premier Zhou Enlai invited me to dinner, and we spent something like 6 hours together. First we had a long conversation, then we had the elaborate dinner, then we had another long conversation. And during those 6 hours, at one point, Premier Zhou Enlai said, we understand that you and Professor Lee are no longer working together. Is that because of some friction between the two ladies? What that reflects was a kind of, it's more than just a casual statement. It's an expression of his and the Chinese people's concern. I said, my answer was, no, it has absolutely nothing to do with that. And being an extremely experienced person, Premier Zhou did not take up the subject again. It's now 71 to today is another 40 years. I think there are many, especially if you go into the internet, there are all kinds of comments. It's an eternal regret on my part. In fact, in the 1950s, at the time of our successful collaboration, I remembered one day I was reading a famous poem. It's a famous poem by one of the greatest Chinese poets of the Song Dynasty. He lived around the year 1100. His name was Su Dongpo. He was a great scholar, very popular, not only in China, but also in Japan. And he had a younger brother who was also a great scholar, but his brother was more successful as a government official than Su himself. And Su wrote a poem to his brother in which there were two lines which greatly moved me when I read it. It says something like, 与君世世为兄弟. I wish we'll be brothers in all future generations to finish our unfinished togetherness in this generation. So, something like, it's beautifully put. I remembered when I read those, I was deeply moved. Today, when I read those again, I can only say that perhaps such great success is not likely to last forever. It's to my eternal regret. As to what precisely has happened, there were publications by me and by T.D. Lee and by commentaries by other people. I'm sure this matter, after our lives, will be researched by some people. Lee is 4 years younger than I. As far as I know, he's still in good health, like I am.
A few years later, in 1966, you had a new start. You left the Institute for Advanced Study, where you had been since, what, 49 or 48, to come to Stony Brook. Now, you've written that shortly before that decision, Oppenheimer had approached you as a possible successor.
Yes.
That his choice to be his successor at the Institute for Advanced Study. So yet you chose this, at that time, I would assume, virtually unknown University of Stony Brook. Can you comment about why what to most people must have been almost as surprising as parity, non-conservation?
In the 60s, Oppenheimer was approximately 60 years old. And he had great difficulties within the Institute for Advanced Studies. The Institute has only about 20 professors, and among which the mathematicians form the largest and the most prominent group internationally. That's how the Institute got constituted from the beginning. And the mathematicians did not like Oppenheimer. That is itself a very complicated story. And of course, at these faculty meetings, there is a tendency to have the mathematicians gang up against Oppenheimer. So the physicists, of course, support Oppenheimer. So therefore, you might say that beginning in the early 60s, it's clear to everybody, especially to Oppenheimer, that I was one of the people who was a strong supporter of him. And I remember that it's about 1962 or 63. He evidently was negotiating with Mrs. Meyer. Mrs. Meyer is the mother of Katharine Graham, the publisher of Washington Post. Mrs. Meyer was a very rich lady. She and Freer, the one who donated the Freer Gallery Vault in Washington, D.C., had a very large collection of Chinese antique. She said, Mrs. Meyer told me that she and Freer went to China in the early 20th century and bought a lot of these. Many of these became a part of the Freer Gallery of Art. And she has a estate in Chappaqua. So one day Oppenheimer asked me and Chile with the Oppenheimers to visit Mrs. Meyer, and we stayed there for a couple of days. It's because Mrs. Meyer was interested, perhaps, in giving that property to the Institute. So it's clear I did not completely appreciate what's going on. I was there. I was happy to meet this old lady and admired her collection of Chinese antiques. But in retrospect, I know that Oppenheimer had a certain ideas already. But anyway, that deal didn't go through. So in 1965, Oppenheimer one day dropped my office and said he thought he would like to retire soon. He asked me about my feelings about it. It took me by surprise, but reflecting on it for a few moments, I said, I think that's a good idea because the mathematicians had been making troubles for you, but there's a lull, particularly at this moment, in that opposition. And you had just gotten the Enrico Fermi Prize from President Johnson, so perhaps it is the right moment. And he, of course, agreed. Then he said that I would like to propose you to be my successor as the director. That came out completely out of the blue. So I remembered very soon I said, I doubt that I would be very happy as a director, but I said I'll think about it. Up to that moment, I had no administrative experience, and I didn't particularly like administrative experiences. So that it was, of course, my natural reaction. So after thinking about it for a while, just at that time, John Toll called me. And he dropped by to see me in Princeton. I had known him, of course, because we had overlapped in Princeton in my early days in Princeton. And he came and he said, I had just accepted the presidency of a new branch of SUNY on Long Island at Stony Brook. So I congratulated him, and then he said he wants that campus to become a research-oriented campus to compete with Berkeley on the East. And he would like me to join him. That come again completely out of blue. So I said I was flattered, but I have to think about it. So these two things sort of combined and occurred at the same time in '65. Then Stony Brook called me. Like the chairman was Alec Pond, and arranged for me with Chile and our two younger children to visit. And I remembered we were put up in Sunwood. And I later wrote that it was a beautiful spring day in May. In the late afternoon, the window framed a setting sun over the sound, and it captured our heart. So after that experience, Chile and I decided we would accept John Toll's offer, and I wrote to Oppenheimer something like, I do not know whether I would become a good director, but I am certain that I would not really enjoy the life of a director. But be that as it may, in fact, even before my answer, Oppenheimer was found to have terminal cancer. So he announced his resignation, and then in '66 we moved to Stony Brook, and in early '67 he died. In fact, in '66 we moved to Stony Brook, so we vacated our house. That house was built by Herman Weyl, the one who had originated the gauge idea. And after Herman Weyl died, the house was sold back to the Institute, and we bought it. And I stayed in it from '57 to '66. Then we moved. And just at that time, Oppenheimer was retiring. And he had to move out of Olden Manor, the Institute director's office. So he moved into that house that the Weyl built, that we occupied for many years. And he died next year in that house. Later on, I sometimes drive by and found the house is still there, but it has changed color from yellow to white.
More in the Princeton style.
And I also asked later people at the Institute, it no longer belongs to the Institute. It's somehow sold to an outsider.
Well, Oppenheimer is obviously a name that comes up, and he's a character who's remained of interest to the general community as a unique personality of the 20th century. You knew him for a fairly long time, and obviously you had very good relations with him. What I've heard personally, people have very, very different opinions about what he accomplished and his personality. What comments?
Oppenheimer was a brilliant person in many respects. He was a brilliant physicist. Unfortunately for him, his greatest contribution to physics was not yet recognized as important at the time that he passed away. It's about the black hole. He was the pioneer in that field. He did many things in physics, all of which were good papers, but except for that one, he did not make I would say, the really first rank physics research contribution. He had a great influence in American physics because he brought back from Europe, where he got his PhD, quantum mechanics. So by the time that, when I was a graduate student, all of the department chair and the leading theorists were his students. He has a mesmerizing way of talking. And he enjoyed that. And he, in some sense, maximized that aspect of his talents. That, however, is regarded by some people as too slippery. He likes to make, when he wants to convey an idea, he does not want to make a straight statement. He would make an elliptical statement and let you sort of appreciate it. This is very effective, and that's why it has a mesmerizing effect. But for people who like straightforward statement, it's a little bit too tangential, too slippery. And he has I think somebody should make a psychoanalysis of him. He has a tendency to hurt people, quite unnecessarily. I was not early enough to be his graduate student in Berkeley, but there are famous stories about his Berkeley days in the 30s, when he was both loved and feared by his students, because they learned a lot from him, and he also took care to get them good jobs, and yet he sometimes ruthlessly would put them down at lectures and so forth. By the time I got to know him in 1949, when I first went to the Institute, he has already mellowed a lot, but still there were occasions when he would make the speaker very, very embarrassed, including Fock, the famous Soviet physicist Fock. I remember Fock once made a seminar at the Institute, and Oppenheimer really gave him a very hard time. I'll tell you a story which illustrates part of his personality. This has not been published before. It must be 63, 64. The Greek embassy called Oppenheimer and said the Greek queen, Frederica, is coming to the United States to visit, and she would like to discuss physics. So Oppenheimer, of course. So they arranged for the Queen to come on a Saturday afternoon, and the Queen and her daughter would stay in Oppenheimer's house, and in the afternoon, the Queen went to Oppenheimer's office at the Institute, and that evening there was a small dinner. The small dinner was very small indeed. It consists of the two Oppenheimers, the Queen and her daughter, who was a teenager at that time, who is now the Queen of Spain. Her name was Sophia. She's now Queen Sophia of Spain. And Chile and me and another couple. So as soon as I entered Oppenheimer's house at maybe 6 o'clock, I knew something's wrong, because this is sort of frigid. My guess was that their conversation in Oppenheimer's office was not exactly to the liking of either of them. Oppenheimer has a tendency not to tolerate fools. So I don't know what precisely happened. But anyway, we sat down to dinner. And in general, it was a little bit embarrassing, because nobody wants to volunteer any small talks. And then a big dog came. The Oppenheimer had this big dog. And the Queen patted him and said, "Oh, it's a beautiful dog. What breed is it?" And Oppenheimer was sitting at the next end, and he had a pipe in his mouth. So he puffed on the pipe and took it out and put it in and puffed again. And we all sat there waiting for the answer. And eventually it came. He belongs to a dying breed, but he didn't know it. So we all sat there pondering the deep meaning of this statement. That is one aspect of Oppenheimer's personality. I have read a number of biographies. I think none of them is very good. The one which I think is best is the BBC 7-hour sequence about him, screened some 20 or 30 years ago. I'm sure you can find it
a dramatization or a documentary?
It's It's not a document. Well, it's called J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's about how Oppenheimer was selected to direct Los Alamos up to the hearings of 1954. So that was a period that during which I didn't know Oppenheimer most of the time, because the Los Alamos days was before me. But I had asked Beta. It happened Beta was visiting Stony Brook when this was screened on TV. So one day I asked Beta. He said, it's very good.
Stony Brook again. Were people surprised that you came here? Your colleagues at the Institute for Advanced Study, your peers at did anyone express surprise, or was it just taken in stride?
Certainly, John Toll and Alec Pound were not surprised. But the people here were delighted. Now, how about the move on my part? I had been very successful in Princeton. I was there for 17 years, starting essentially as a postdoc. And I did my most important work in research at Princeton. And we had a beautiful house and very close to the institute, so I walked to my office every day. So it was my ivory tower, which it was difficult to decide to leave. In fact, in 2006, I brought Fan Fan there for the first time. We drove from Stony Brook. We were visiting Stony Brook, and we drove to Princeton. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we went around the grounds, and we went and sat next to the small lake back of the institute. And Fan Fan, it was beautiful, and the azaleas were in blossom. And Fan Fan said, how could you decide to leave this paradise? What did I answer? I said, yes, it was a difficult decision. And I had asked myself many times since that time whether the decision was correct. And my answer has always been, it is correct. Because the ivory tower is not the whole world. The world is much bigger than the ivory tower. And indeed, I think that my coming to Stony Brook opened a new chapter of my life. And I think it's a rewarding chapter too.
So when you arrived at Stony Brook, there was one of your great contributions, if I may say. You wrote one of your most influential papers within a year or so of arriving here, in which you solved, as we say, a one-dimensional system of an essentially infinite number of particles with a deceptively simple interaction between them. In this project, you derived what's now known as the Yang-Baxter equation. Another of your works that had a huge influence on mathematics, I believe. Did you have a sense that that might happen?
No, not at all.
You didn't see knot theory somehow hidden in...
No. I have always liked many-body problem, which is a branch of physics, very much mathematical, but very different from particle physics. I have liked that already when I was a graduate student in China. And so in the 50s, I told you a few minutes ago that after the parity paper that Lee and I wrote in 56, we thought that that's not solving the main problem. So we went to statistical mechanics. So that was a period in which I was working on that. And then in 1961, I was visiting Stanford, and Bill Fairbank was doing the flux quantization experiment. That's a very important experiment. So I got interested in that, and that led me to come back to statistical mechanics again. So through most of the 1960s, especially after I moved to Stony Brook, my main work was in statistical mechanics. Now, statistical mechanics at that time had some detailed problems, and it's just around that time there was in some area a breakthrough, and I got into that and did a number of work which later were recognized as very important. In particular, in one paper, I exhibited an equation. That equation turns out to be identical to an equation 5 years later written by Baxter. And since that equation turns out to have great use in both physics and math, so it's now called the Young-Baxter equation. So in the 60s, in the late 60s in Stony Brook, my main area of concentration was in that area. I enjoyed that very much. It is a very different kind of physics from particle physics, but it's also another type of thing that I liked very much. Then come the 70s, because of the gauge theory development, I abandoned that and went into gauge theory. Then I have repeatedly said I'm a very fortunate person, because starting in the 1990s, experimental people had developed new laser technology of cooling, so that starting from the 1990s, people can reach very low temperatures. Now something like 10 to the minus 8th degree Kelvin, which is just zero temperature. At that temperature, the Young-Baxter equation describes phenomena which are obscured by the temperature noise. The work which I focused on, which gave rise to the Young-Baxter equation, does not describe the daily phenomena because the temperature is too high. But when you can reach such low temperatures, that becomes the right type of problem. So therefore, that area has become hot again. That the new hot area is called cold atoms, because it's very cold atoms. And so in the last 4 or 5 years, I got back into this area, and there are a lot of things which one can do. So I'm very happy that I come back at my age to this frontiers research area.
Well, you said that you were interested in applications of symmetry as one theme, and as applied to things like gauge theories and also to statistical mechanics. Now, gauge theories and statistical mechanics, well, much of what is thought of as modern in those fields begin with Maxwell. And Einstein also made important connections in these two fields that seem so different. Can you find something in common between the two, or it just happens a matter of timing?
I don't think the type of thing that I did in statistical mechanics is deeply related to the concept of symmetry, although it does play a role in it, but it's not an essential role. Somehow, I'm very fortunate that I got launched into both areas, statistical mechanics and particle physics, with emphasis on symmetry. I got launched into this already as a graduate student. I always tell my graduate students that as a graduate student, your most important responsibility to yourself is not just to learn some technical things, either experimental techniques or calculational techniques. It is to get yourself into a field that is developing, that is going to prosper in the next 5 to 10 years. If you get into such a field, you are likely to grow with that field. And that is the best situation. So I always think that the most important contribution a professor can make to his graduate student is to launch him into the right area. A graduate student launched into the right area, preferably an area that's just then developing. A student in such an area is likely easily to prosper. If a person gets into an area which has been there for 20 years, then it's likely that he would have greater difficulties.
Well, coming back to your experiences here at Stony Brook, of course, one of the highlights was your interaction with Jim Simons and the developments that brought physics and mathematics together in a way that they had done historically. So can you mention something about your first interactions with Jim Simons, which I understand were not in mathematics?
When I came to Stony Brook's math department was, I was told, was nondescript. It has a few professors, but none of them were really doing any research. And John Toll's great priority was to find the right chairman. And after a couple of years, he finally found Jim. Jim, as you know, is a very brilliant mathematician, but also he's a great entrepreneur. He apparently, after his PhD, has gone to do some business in South America somewhere. And then he came back, and I think he got fired from one of the government organizations. And I do not know who recommended him to John Toll. But anyway, after Jim came, I once talked to Professor Chern, my teacher, who was at that time at Berkeley. And Chern said that Jim is absolutely the right choice. So I got to know Jim very rapidly. And the first thing that we collaborated on was one day he came to my office and said, Frank, let's organize an anti-war fund. I didn't know what the anti-war fund was. This was in the late 60s, and there was the student revolution in America against the Vietnam War. And the many campuses were organizing anti-war fund so that the fund would go eventually to help elect senators and congressmen who followed the right policy about the Vietnam War. And that was a beginning type of organization on all campuses. So Jim said, let's do this. So I agreed. And so we got the faculty together and so on and so forth. We had several meetings. And I remember one thing. There's a union building, student union building. Outside of the union building, we erected a big thermometer, which told us how much money we had raised. I had a picture of that. And recently, I wanted to find that picture because that illustrates my first collaboration with Jim. Unfortunately, I couldn't find it. Of the hundreds of photographs that I examined, this didn't exist. But anyway, in fact, we raised more funds on this campus than any other campus. More than MIT, more than Harvard, more than Michigan. Michigan is a huge university, but we raised more funds. So that's my first collaboration with Jim. The second collaboration was in science. In 1969, I was teaching a course on general relativity. General relativity is deeply related to differential geometry. So I wrote down on the blackboard one day a key formula of differential geometry. As I wrote the formula down, I said to myself, this looks very much like one of the equations that Mills and I had used. During the lecture, I couldn't, of course, think more about that. But after the lecture, I immediately sat down in my office and checked. Then I found that the two are not just similar. In fact, in a right interpretation, they are exactly the same. So I realized that there's something deep in this. Both are mathematical formula. So I went to Jim, and I said that here, this is the Riemann equation in differential geometry. This is what we have been doing in physics. They look the same. And he looked at it, and after a while he said, yes, they are both fiber bundles. So I didn't know what fiber bundle was. So that began my education about fiber bundles. Eventually, he first gave me a book, a famous book on fiber bundles. But it's a mathematics book which a physicist cannot read. It's just too dry. So I asked Jim later to give us a series of lectures. That was very important for me and in some sense for physics, because he explained it must be, were you here at that time or not yet?
No, I was not personally here.
But Bill and Fred were all here. And so after these luncheon lectures, I realized that the whole structure of gauge theory is in fact fiber bundle mathematics. They are not similar, they are exactly the same. So after I understood that there was, in some sense, an electrifying effect. Why? Because here, these gauge theory equations is written down because they have something to do with natural phenomena. It describes gauge theory equations. The simplest gauge theory equation is Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's equation describes everything. Today, everything that we see is a part of Maxwell's equations. So how come this is identical with some mathematical ideas? The mathematicians did not get fiber bundles out of contact with reality. They sort of dreamed them up. So that had a dawned on me that the fundamental structure of the universe, whether it was God or whoever created it, the rules of how to construct the universe is deeply mathematical, which mathematicians can get onto without contact with reality. They just started with 1, 2, 3, 4 and got there. That, I think, is why there is that. Why is nature constructed that way? I think it's a deep question, philosophical and religious, and I'm afraid it would never be answered. But anyway, as far as I'm concerned, after I understood that, I wrote a paper with my friend T.T. Wu of Harvard. And in that paper, we had a small table, a dictionary, identifying gauge theory terminology with the fiber bundle terminology. There were maybe 15 items. But there's one item which in physics is very important, and we call it J, current. Current means electric current.
Just like in the wall. Right?
Yes, it's just, current is the right term. And I took that to Jim and said, all these names, we have found the right translation. What is the translation of current? He thought about it and said, we don't deal with this quantity. And so we wrote a paper with that table, and side by side with J, there's a blank space. And then E.C. Singer of MIT came to visit, and I had known him because we were contemporaries. I in physics, he in math at Chicago. And so I showed him this paper, this manuscript, and we talked about it. He got very interested, and he took it with him to England, where he collaborated with Singer, with Atiyah. And soon they produced a paper, a famous paper, co-authored by Atiyah, Singer, and Hitchin, in which they solved the equation of gauge theory using a famous theorem called Atiyah-Singer theorem. Atiyah-Singer theorem already has existed and was recognized as a very important theorem because it connects many mathematical ideas together. And using that, they were able to solve some gauge theory equation. Because of their prominence in mathematics, the world mathematicians sat up and took notice and realized that what they were doing with in fiber bundle theory is in fact deeply related to the structure of nature. The mathematicians, in some sense, had been worried in the back of their mind because they know that what they have been doing was very beautiful, but they had to get funding from the government. If it does not have any practical application, they know eventually they might get into trouble. They are aware of this. So when they found that what they were doing in abstract mathematics is deeply related to the structure of the universe, they realized that this is very good for them. So they rushed into it. And lo and behold, in fact, one student of Atiyah, Donaldson, using this context in a very elaborate theory, which I do not understand, produced a theorem called the Donaldson's theorem. And that theorem can be understood in daily language. It is that the 4 dimensions is very different from 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. 4 is strange. Dimensions 1, 2, 3, and 5, 6, 7, and up all share one property. They knew that. They have proven that. They couldn't settle the question of. They could not understand the deep structure of 4 dimensions, and now, with the contact with gauge theory, Donaldson showed that 4 dimensions has infinitely many very complex structures which are absent in all other dimensions. This, in fact, makes many people fear, both theoretical physicists and mathematicians, that is the reason why nature is 4-dimensional. But that is something very deep, which I think is still developing.
Certainly, this is an example of a collaborative moment in history between mathematicians and physicists, yet they remain different. In one of your, I think, an article about Einstein, you said something along the lines that two fields share some things in common, yet what you termed as their life force remains distinct.
Yes.
Now here, okay, so given all this, yet there is still this remaining difference. Can we come back to that and characterize it?
Hilbert space in mathematics came from pure mathematics. Quantum mechanics came from reality. And it's found that at the base level, this concept is shared deeply by both. But the development of both fields have different value judgments. And these value judgments are not the same. How the mathematicians got onto fiber wonders was because they were guided by their value judgment. How physicists got onto gauge theory was because we were guided by physical ideas, of course with the help of Hermann Weyl. But Hermann Weyl was really a mathematician and also a philosopher. Because of the fact that they have different value judgments, it means that in some sense, if you train a graduate student, eventually he will be either a mathematician or a physicist. The two fields are now wide enough. It is difficult for a person really to share deeply the value judgment of both disciplines.
The Simon Center in which we're sitting today has the goal of making sure that the separation between the fields does not get too big over time, but still retaining the identity.
Yes, and I think the name shows that Jim evidently is delighted. Fiber bundle is a deeply geometrical concept, and that's also the original field, research field of Jim. So the contact between geometry and physics is so close is evidently one of the reasons that Jim wanted to found this center.
Around the time that you and Jim were discussing these connections between mathematics and physics, there were kind of tectonic shifts taking place in the world outside that changed your life. So perhaps you could recall the story you told me recently about your first trip to China, how you got the idea that here it was, 1972 perhaps, and how you came to realize that you might be able to take that trip, and then what happened, how you met Zhou Enlai, eventually Chairman Mao.
You know that China and America fought this devastating Korean War. And then there were conflicts also in Vietnam. But by 1969, China almost had a war with the Soviet Union. There were two skirmishes, in both of which both sides lost some soldiers. One in northeastern China, one in northwestern China. So by late 1969, Chairman Mao and the Premier Zhou Enlai were very worried about the relationship between China and the Soviet Union. In the meantime, Nixon was very worried about the Soviet Union. So later history showed that it was Nixon's idea on the American side to contact China, and on the Chinese side, It's Mao and Chou's idea. How did they approach each other? I think they first approached each other through some embassy, I think in Poland, a Chinese embassy in Poland. But eventually, in the summer of 1971, Kissinger went to China secretly from Pakistan. Now, I had, after China and the United States became enemies and were not on speaking terms, I kept contact with my family, with my parents and my brothers and sister in China, because my idea was that nobody can blame me for trying to maintain family contact. This is not a trivial statement, because most of the Chinese American scholars in America did not want to do this. They were afraid it would cause damage on either or both sides. So I was in contact with my family, and in 1971, I could detect that the two governments were testing water. There was the ping-pong diplomacy, I remembered. And then suddenly, one day, I read a small item in the New York Times, which said that the previous rule that American passports do not hold in communist China is now abandoned. So I knew that this something must be happening. So I wrote to my father saying that I would like to visit my family in Shanghai. And he got permission from the Chinese government to cable back to me saying that you're welcome. You will have, you can get a visa in Ottawa or in Paris. That's the two Western countries where China has an embassy. Before I left for China that summer, I wrote to Edward. Edward was the president's science advisor in Washington. And because I felt that it's not good if I just go to China suddenly without informing anybody in Washington. And back came a statement saying that that's fine, but we cannot help you to get a visa, which I didn't need. So I flew to Paris, and I still remembered I went to the Chinese embassy, and they already had heard about this. So they offered me tea and produced a piece of paper because they do not recognize the American passport. And that piece of paper said C.N. Yang is allowed to visit China for a few months. And then I went to the American embassy in Paris because in my passport, in my American passport, there was a sign, that there was a footnote which said this passport is not valid for use in North Vietnam, in communist China, I think in Cuba, and in some other place. So I went there, and they had already been informed by the State Department. So there was a secretary there who crossed that and stamped it. So I got my passport validated correctly. Then I went out, and at the corner of Champs-Élysées and Avenue George 5th, I saw a newsstand with a newspaper saying Kissinger something. My French was no good. I didn't understand what's going on. So I bought a copy and went to my French friend. And he said, it says, Kissinger has just come back from Beijing. So Kissinger beat me by 1 week to Beijing. And that newspaper said that Kissinger has negotiated for President Nixon to visit China next February. So that began my a new chapter of my life. I went to China, and of course that was in 71, which was still in the Cultural Revolution time. And in retrospect, there were two things that happened to me in that. First, I left China in 1945, and I found that the China of 1971 is absolutely totally different from the China of 1945. The China of 1945 was the result of several centuries of non-industrial society, which was still agricultural, with essentially no industries. Then came 8 years of war. So it was a country in which perhaps 95% of the people were illiterate. The China I found in 1971 is very different. I do not know what was the statistics, but certainly I'm sure by that time they have gotten literacy up to maybe 80%. Now I think it's 95% literacy. So that contrast made a very big impression on me. When I was a child, there was still opium all over the place. My uncle's family would serve opium when they have guests. When the communists came, they abandoned. In fact, I have a cousin who was despised by the family because he smoked opium in the 1930s. He was older. He was maybe 20 years older than I. When I saw him again in 1971, he had a face which was very healthy. So I said, what precisely happened? He said the communists came and no more opium, and he suffered for half a year. He became a farmer, and now he was a farmer, so therefore his face was very healthy. So that greatly moved me, in that I realized that the new China is very different from the old China. But there's another thing. The Cultural Revolution is a disaster for China. But I didn't know it at that time because I was fed all kinds of information. And of course, nobody, including my parents, did not tell me the depth of the devastation to China because of the Cultural Revolution. Part of it they did not know. And part of it, some things they know, they would not tell me. So when I came back to the United States, you were not here yet, I remembered people were very curious because here is a person whom they knew very well in America. And he had gone to this big country, which is very mysterious. So I was asked by the student body here to give a talk. And that day I gave a talk in that lecture hall complex. And it's absolutely filled. And I still have a record of my talk. It was all positive because I did not know any of the strange and unbelievably damaging things which has happened. In other words, I did not know the Cultural Revolution was a political infight within the communist government. Today it's clear Mao was afraid that after he passes away, people would denounce him like Stalin been denounced. So therefore he had to sack all kinds of people that he was afraid of, and that included Deng Xiaoping. But fortunately, he did not dislike Deng Xiaoping enough to get him, for example, killed or totally disabled. And in fact, in 1973, he got Deng Xiaoping back. And that was very fortunate, because when he died in 76, Deng Xiaoping came back, and Deng Xiaoping is a communist, but he is a very practical person. And he led China for another 15 years, which created this economic resurgence of China over the last 30 years.
So you did meet with these historical personages in your early visits, Zhou Enlai and Chairman Mao. You recall for us what that was like, to meet people like that? Well, you had actually mentioned Zhou Enlai earlier in one of these. What was Chairman Mao? Well, I hate to say what was he like, but I mean, what was it like meeting him? What was it like to go into the office? What was the scene like?
I had read a lot about Chairman Mao, of course, before I went. And he's a very good poet. And he's a very good poet from the literary viewpoint. But of course, he injected into his poems his political vision. So that made it a kind of powerful poetry. He was a remarkable person, because one of the most famous poem of his is called Ode to Snow. But it started with a description of the scenery, a snowy scenery. But he expanded on that, and became a description of the sweep of history of China. That was a famous poem, and I had always thought that he must have written this poem after he had already been enthroned in Beijing, after China has already become, perhaps in the 1960s or 70s. But no, it was written when he was holed up in Yan'an at a time when the communists was just a very small rebel group in a small town. This shows that Mao has a vision and ambition and deep insight into the structure of Chinese society. Later on, after he became very famous in the 1950s, he had the idea that China could go the communist route fast. So he said in 2 years, China's industrial production should exceed that of Great Britain. Something like in 10 years, it should exceed the industrial production of America, which is ridiculous, because many of the people still did not have enough to eat in China in those days. And that was disastrous. He forced this onto the government, onto the country. So between 1960 and 1962, it's now estimated that 20 to 30 million people died. How did they know that? Because they plotted the population, and there's a kink there. So by extrapolation, they know that some 20 or 30 million people must have died. This is now, I think, recognized to be correct, both outside of China and inside of China. But he persisted. He was a very proud person, a very powerful person, and he would not want people, he did not want to entertain opposition. And in his old age, he was afraid that he would be denounced. So that's the origin of the Cultural Revolution. But fortunately for China, he did not kill Deng Xiaoping. Instead, he brought him out, and after he died, Deng Xiaoping appeared as a very sensible person. People asked Deng Xiaoping, "What's your main policy?" He said, my policy is when I cross a river, I just select the selective pebbles and stand on them and walk over. In Chinese, this is a very poetic statement, which essentially says, I don't really see far ahead. I just step by step manage the current affairs. And indeed, that characterized his policies. Everybody now knows that there's a miracle of Chinese economic resurgence after Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978. My observation, after having resided in China for the last 10 years, for the last 7 years, is that it's based on two things. One is traditional Chinese culture. The second is the organization power of the communist government. The two together are both essential for what happened in China. A derivative of the statement is that that model cannot be copied. If you want to copy it, you can only copy you try to copy the organizational structure. You cannot copy Chinese culture. What do I mean by this? Chinese culture emphasizes something which is deeply foreign to the Western mind. It's that you first ask about yourself before you ask what you are entitled to in the world. In fact, that spirit is exactly what Kennedy said. Kennedy, one of his famous statements was, ask not what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for the country. That statement is, in fact, in my opinion, the main reason why Chinese culture, having embraced this in a deep way, creates a social phenomenon in which you have millions of people who work very hard, who are less likely to go onto the street and demand more wages than people in the West.
And yet that is happening a bit more now. Even the last few years have seen some shifts. Now, would you put those down as just
Yes.
an uncharacteristic influence?
That's right. And in fact, before that, in 1989, there was the Tiananmen affair. What did the Tiananmen affair, what exactly happened? It started with students who demanded that some corruption be corrected. And it snowballed. So that eventually it became the Tiananmen Square with more than 1 million students. 1 million students is a large number, but of course with 1.3 billion people, it's not that large, but nevertheless, it became a threat. The workmen did not join that. It was, in 1989, it was just the students. Today, with the internet, of course, the whole environment has changed. So yes, there are problems. And you read in the New York Times these days that the Chinese government is evidently extremely worried. So far, no large-scale demonstration has happened. My observation residing on Tsinghua campus and how the university manages student affairs, I think that there will be no large repetition of what's happening in Egypt, in China.
Well, and from the industrial point of view, you think that the level of the workers in factories, people who often migrate from rural areas to take up jobs, for example, in the southeastern portion of China, that in the long run they'll make the necessary adjustments. I assume that to avoid labor unrest, for example, is purely on economic grounds.
What's happening is, first, when Deng Xiaoping had the idea, one of the key statements of Deng Xiaoping was, let some people be wealthy first. That is a revolutionary statement in a communist country. And it worked. So they opened up the seaports, 4 of them, and attracted foreign investment. And happily for China, there are many millionaires in Hong Kong, and there are also millionaires in Taiwan. So these were the first people who jumped and made a lot of money in these ports. And these companies that they established attracted rural workers. So now there are hundreds of millions of workers each year who move from inland to the seashore ports. And that is what created the wealth of China in the last 30 years. But now, wages are rising in the sea coast. So these investors move them inward. I have a graduate student at the Chinese University. He is from Xi'an in central China. And each year around the Chinese New Year, he would move back. He would go back, like these hundreds of millions of rural workers. They would go back to visit their family because the Lunar New Year is the family reunion period. So he went back, and he spent 2 weeks. And just before I came here, I saw him. So I said, "You were back for 2 weeks?" He said, "Yes." I said, "How's the economy?" He said, "It's booming." I said, "How come?" He said, "Because all these companies in the coast area found that it's too expensive there to operate, so they moved to our neighborhood." And that is in the center of China. There's still a lot of left region to move to. So this wave of industrial development, like a tide, is moving. Now there's a question. After it has moved to the far end, what happens? What happens is that the wages would rise. And this big imbalance that Obama is worried about would by nature disappear. To keep these hundreds of millions of workers not cause revolution is one of the great problems, of course, for the Chinese leadership. And they have been doing that without too much disruption, except for this Tiananmen affair. That they can do that, I think, is because of Chinese culture. Chinese culture is very different. It's Chinese culture is based on the idea that human relations is the most important, not human rights. So therefore, you try to fit into your environment, and that's the most important idea.
Among the millionaires, the older family wealth in Hong Kong is the Shaw family. And you had a connection with them, which apparently led to the recently the establishment of prizes, which include a prize for mathematics, to come a little bit down and back to the mathematics theme. Would you like to make some comments about the Shaw prizes and what you see as their role?
Ren Shaw came from a family that was sort of a small movie theater operator in Shanghai. Then in the 1930s and 40s, the family moved to Singapore. And apparently Ren Shaw and his brother had some old-style movie projectors. So they went to the villages and showed movies to the peasants. And in the 30s, it was extremely popular. So they accumulated some wealth. And then starting in the 1950s, he and his brother decided his brother would stay in Singapore to further develop, and he would go to Hong Kong to develop. So he went to Hong Kong and started a movie producing company. For some 20 or 30 years, it was the largest movie producer in Asia. So he amassed a fortune. And then when TV came, his company went into TV. So his company is now the largest TV and cable TV company in Hong Kong. And in the 1980s, I was visiting Chinese University in Hong Kong quite often. And Sir Ren was one of the board members of the Chinese University. So I got to know him a bit. And one day he asked me, evidently he was thinking about the possibility of emulating the Nobel Prize. So he asked me about the Nobel Prize. So I told him that the Nobel Prize has been eminently successful for several reasons. One, it was a big prize. It's the highest financial reward. Second, it has stayed very long, almost a century at that time. And I said that, for example, before the First World War, there was a very important international prize in mathematics. Both Hilbert and Poincaré had won it. But after the First World War, the mark went down by a factor of 1,000,000, so the prize disappeared. So if you have a prize which is permanent, it would become influential. And third, I said their selection process has been done very well. So by and large, especially in the sciences, their selection has been universally supported. So I told this to Sir Ren, and nothing happened. So evidently he was thinking about it, but he didn't decide. Then in 2002, some 15 years after that, he was already 90-something. And his wife asked me, and this time it's for real. She said Sir Ren wanted to establish a prize. So we discussed that, and we got a a few people in education and in sciences, mostly university people, and we wrote a bylaw and so on and forth. So in 2004, the first prize was awarded, and we have 3 prizes each year. 3 prizes are in 3 science fields: astronomy and mathematics. These were different from the Nobel Prizes, but 1 prize, biology and medicine, overlaps with that of the Nobel. We chose that because of the fact that biology and medicine is a huge field. It could certainly accommodate 2 prizes. So we have so far given 7 annual awards, and it has been very well received. I think part of the reason is because we have some policies which, in my opinion, are better than the Nobel Prize in the long run. That is the following. Nobel Prize also has 3 science prizes. The other 2, literature and peace, is not in the same category. They're there because value judgment is very complicated. So Sir Reverend doesn't want to touch those. With the 3 science prizes, we have a committee of 5 people for astronomy and mathematics, and 7 people for biology and medicine. And these committees do the first screening of the candidates. But the difference between us and the Nobel Prize is that the Nobel Prize by bylaw has committee members who must be Swedes. Now, Sweden is a small country. It doesn't have any top scientists. So therefore, most of the committee members of the 3 science committees are not the top scientists, while we have no such rules. So therefore, our committee members, 17 of them, are essentially all of them absolutely first-rate scientists. I think over the long run, their judgment should be better than that of judgment of the science committees of Sweden.
So given what you said, the importance, the success over the years of a prize, that this is truly worth the effort that goes into it, speaks to a role for our scientists of personal ambition. One thinks the honor, the monetary reward, the fact that in fact there's a larger monetary reward with the Nobel, with the Shaw Prizes. At the same time, there's something more, both for physicists and mathematicians. Is there any way to try to give your perspective on the combination of the importance of personal ambition and of a kind of wonder at nature? How do the 2 combine?
In every field, the frontiers research area shifts from time to time. So therefore, the committee does have each committee does have a job of trying to balance contributions from different areas. Let's take, for example, mathematics. You know that the mathematicians have a term called core math. Core math does not include the computer sciences. Core math does not include the theoretical physics. Core mathematics does not include statistics. But on the other hand, the mathematicians also created a term called mathematical sciences. Mathematical sciences include all these things which are outside of core mathematics. Now, among the mathematicians, there is a question of the mathematicians all agree that core mathematics is important. Where they do diverge is how much importance should be assigned to non-core mathematics. And this is a very subtle question for which I don't think there is a simple cut and dried solution. So therefore, the attitude toward this question is one of the things that's debated within the math committee. And that is true in every field. In astronomy, how much emphasis should be given to cosmology? How much should be given to, let's say, the recent planetary developments? So it's a composite judgment about these questions from the different members that would determine how that particular type of that particular branch of the Shaw Prize is going to emphasize. The Shaw Math Prize committee is rather broad-minded, and this is one of the consequences of the fact that Atiyah has been the chair for a long time. He has always want to broaden the meaning of mathematics from traditional core mathematics.
To go back to the theme of Chinese culture momentarily, one of the things that over the years you've talked about, you talked recently, I mean, right here about how Chinese culture, how important it is. Now in education, your own education, would you describe it? It was scientific. Would you describe your education as being Chinese education or a Western education from the scientific point of view?
Before 1900, there were traditional education in China. Basically, you read the classics. And even tongue poetry was not that emphasized. It was Confucius and the historical writings that were emphasized. And there was a great debate in China starting around at the beginning of the 20th century of how much Western culture should be imported. In particular, how much modern science should be taught. There were fierce debates, but it's clear that the circumstances forced China to accept importing more Western knowledge, ideas, and especially technology. By now, the curriculum of a Chinese high school, for example, is essentially the same as the curriculum here, only with a very different emphasis. What's the emphasis? What's the difference? It's heavily teacher-guided training. And the students have to do a lot of exercises. In China, I would say the majority of the parents say that the Chinese system is the educational system is no good.
Really?
Because they said, look, my kids have no free time. Look at the American kids. The American kids has all kinds of free time to do this and do that. And our system would create people who only know books and know nothing else. But here you have also this Tiger Mother book, which evidently touched a nerve on the part of American parents. So apparently I read that there are two camps. One said she's absolutely right. The other said she's to be denounced. I think what's happening is that there are two different philosophies of education. And in my opinion, neither is perfect. And for the American system, more of the Chinese ideas should be injected. And for the Chinese system, more of the American system should be injected. But that's not easy because there's entrenched interest. If you want the Chinese high schools to adopt some of the ideas of the American educational system, I'm sure that that doesn't exist National Teachers Union, but it will exist in China. I'm sure they will be opposed because you are asking them to do something that they have not been trained to do. So of course, I would say vice versa is here. Actually, I believe what is going on is the following. This is my theory. I think the Chinese system is better for students, let's say, from grade 60 to grade 90.
From which in age?
Not age, to his level. If you rank all students from 0 to 100,
I see.
The 60 percentile to 80 or 90 percentile, the Chinese system is good. Why? Because you drill these students. So therefore, they are bright enough to learn. So after they graduate from school, they can do exercise. They come to America, they become the best students. Why? When I was teaching freshmen here in Stony Brook, most of the students cannot manipulate the trigonometric functions. When I taught freshmen in Tsinghua, that's not a problem. They have all been trained. So that means that this cut of students would become good, useful citizens, while their counterpart in America wander around. Some of them could survive, but they are not trained in the technical way. That is the reason why these international tests, in all these international tests, the American students performed near the bottom. This year, I think there was a test, the Shanghai students were declared the best. Yes. But for somebody who is over 90, it's obvious that the American system is better. Why? Because because they don't need training. And the American system allows them to have more imagination, bolder ideas, and also with the American venture capital system, many of them could prosper. So you have Steve Jobs, you have all these people who create wealth for the whole world. So it depends on the student, which philosophy is better.
There's one little story that I know you've told about your connection with the family of a very exceptional student. This was the Ma family, whose son Yo-Yo you had some interaction with long ago when you were visiting Paris. Could you recount that?
I first met Mao Yo-yo because Chile and I and Franklin, our oldest son, were visiting Paris in the summer of 1957. And we had an apartment near the Luxembourg Park. And so Chile oftentimes brought Franklin, who was 6 years old, to sail a small sailboat in the pond there. And one day, she saw a Chinese lady with 2 children. And that turned out to be the 2 children were Yo-Yo Ma and his sister. His sister was 4 years older than he. And quickly we found that the 2 kids were very musically talented. It's obvious that Mao Yo-yo at age 2 already had absolute pitch. We had a small piano in our apartment, so we tested him, and sure enough, he had absolute pitch. Well, at first we didn't think more about this, but then one day we had to return a book to Mrs. Ma. So we went to her address. Then we were surprised. In 1957, France was not in good shape financially. And the Ma family was very hard up. They sort of lived in, there was a compound with individual rooms, and they just had one room. And they shared the public kitchen facility. They had the public toilet service, but they don't have it by their own. And after we saw that, I remember Chile and I said, this is incredible, because they were hard up, and yet they knew that the 2 kids were musically talented. And Mr. Ma, every week, would bring the girl to go from Paris to Brussels for her to take piano lessons with a famous pianist in Brussels. And Chile and I agree that this is a gamble, which is extremely dangerous. Well, about 10 years later, maybe 8 years later, they moved to America. And Mr. Ma started a music school for children. And apparently he was doing well. And he brought Yo-Yo Ma to Cassell's, who immediately recognized Yo-Yo Ma's talents. And when the Kennedy Center was opened in Washington, Cassell's arranged for Yo-Yo Ma to perform on public TV. So that was when Yo-Yo Ma became instantly famous in America. Then I think perhaps the Tiger Mother education took effect. So, but both children did extremely well. She is no longer a concert pianist, but she sometimes accompanies her brother. And of course, he has become, after Cassell's, the foremost cellist in the world.
In the 40 years or so since your first trip back to China, China has transformed the world stage. What are your hopes and concerns for the future, given this great moment and great changes of a historical nature that have taken place?
Well, you know, I am 88 years old, and first I have to tell you, one day after my marriage with Fan Fan, a correspondent in Taiwan asked me, how do you feel be married to a person so much younger. I said one of the things I realize now after the marriage is that because Fan Fan is so much younger than I, she's going to live way beyond the date when I'm gone. In some sense, it represents a prolongation of my life. It's what is going to happen 50 years from now. I'm still concerned with, deeply concerned with. I think the 21st century will be a very difficult century, especially because it's clear that China is emerging as a world power, and America is beset with lots of difficulties. 5 years ago, it's not clear to everybody that America has great difficulties. But now it's with the financial meltdown and so on and so forth, with the European troubles. This is going to be a big problem. Of course, the world has other problems. The problem how the Islamic world is going to get together or to wake up, and how Africa is going to fit into the world. These are big problems. But perhaps the more immediate problem is how China and America, two very different histories, would manage to get together. I hope the recent interest in China would make more Americans understand Chinese history. China has a very long history, and that long history shapes the structure of the society, the way people think, the way people handle things. And I think, in general, I would say the Americans do not know enough about this. On the other side, America been the leading industrial power for a long time. I think there are more people in China that appreciates many things about how America thinks and how America is structured, more than the other way around. Lack of understanding of Chinese culture when China becomes very powerful is not good. It's potentially dangerous, in fact. The importance of the individual is very different in the Western civilization compared with the Chinese. As I already said, in ancient China, the individual is not important. The important is his relation with the environment. And that emphasis is still very much there and governs everything. I'll give you just one simple example. When a baby is shown to guests in China, you would introduce the baby to this auntie, this uncle, this grandpa, and so on and so forth. In other words, a priori, the first important thing when you meet another person is to identify your personal relationship to him. This structure means that you is a part of society. And that is the determining factor. In America, because of Christianity perhaps, it's you to God. Who is God? Everybody has his own God. You finally are responsible to God, meaning that you have to explain to God what you have done that's good, what you have done that's bad. That's irrespective to the judgment is not relating to society. It's you and God. This a priori difference of the coordinate, in my opinion, is extremely important. Because of this, Western thinking tend to the extremes. there's a cardinal concept called 中庸, which I think, if you want to translate it, will be moderation. It's ancient Chinese culture frowns upon going to the extremes. Perhaps that's also the reason why China did not develop modern science. Modern science, especially in axiomatic field theory, is going to the extremes. It's also the reason why the Soviet Union in, let's say, in the 1670s, think that Chinese communism is not communism. It does not adhere to some fundamental rules of communism. Indeed, if you talk to Zhou Enlai or Deng Xiaoping or Mao, it's the Chinese version. It's communism fitted with the Chinese ideas. And I think that enough people who would appreciate this would play a good role for future relationship between China and America.
Which do you think are the fields or the areas that are likely to lead the way into the next century? Do you think physics will remain as important as it has? Will biology just continue to grow in importance?
I have two things to say about this question. First, 20 years ago, my feeling about the answer to your question has changed from 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I knew the world has lots of problems. My idea was that all of these problems will gradually be solved by new technology. Yes, new technology would create new problems, but by and large, the world would, the productivity of the world would, on average, increase. In other words, technology would overcome not only its own shortcomings, but all the accumulated problems. I'm less optimistic now. I think that the world has multiple problems. Why? This is partly affected. I was partly affected by the mess that has been produced by the American economic system. The American economic system has been extremely successful, and that generated optimistic view. For example, I read the papers. I know that there are the questions about health care, about Social Security, about all these entitlements. And as I read, I do not know how America is going to solve these problems. And because America is the dominant power in the world, that undoubtedly affects my feeling. So on the one part, when you ask about my feeling about the future, I have to say that there's a slight turn in my view about the future. But there's another part. The other part is I'm not a Christian. Following Einstein, I do not think that there is a person man-like person who created the world. But as I become older and older, as I see this, for example, I see this biological research, this research about the brain. You know that 50 years ago there was the feeling that the brain problem would be solved in another 30 years. It's clear from today's viewpoint that they have not even scratched the surface. It's just too complicated. There's a question which cannot be answered. It's what's the whole earth created for? I know in the Bible it said that God has created the man and has also created these animals and created the plants so that man can eat them. So that's, and in fact, man has prospered. The creativity of a person today compared to ancient times is many fold. But what for? What's this all going to become? When you talk about time of the scale of millions of years, then man's history is nothing. And I think these are, I guess when a person gets old, he's likely to be more religious. I have only questions about religion. I have no answers. The difference between a deeply religious person and me is that he also has these deeply religious questions, but then he has answers and I don't. I remembered Wigner was very religious. You probably don't know him.
No, I saw him a few times. But
Many people regarded him as peculiar because of his emotional attachment to religion. I now think that when a person gets old, in China, when a person gets old, he's likely to become religious because he's asking where I'm going to go after I die. So to play it safe, he would donate to the Buddhist temple. He would also donate to the Taoist temple. And if the Catholic Church accepts his donation, he would also donate to the Catholic Church. I'm not in that direction, but I think that what this whole world is going to be, and why is it this, become increasingly a problem that I sometimes think about.
in your trips back to China, starting in the 70s, and then on through the time up until the establishment of the Shoah Prizes most recently, you were involved in a number of exchanges, scientific exchanges, which in some sense echoed your own first trip here to America, and also in the setting up of independent institutes within China, I believe also perhaps in Hong Kong. Can you comment on that particular period when these, what this meant to you and what it might mean to China?
Yes. After my first trip in 1971, I realized that there is something that I should do, because I think I know both countries. I have attachment to both countries of long periods, and I love both countries. And at a time when the two countries are first not on speaking terms, and second, not understanding each other, I have the responsibility to help to bridge this gap. So indeed, that became, after 1971, one of my life's goals. And I've done a number of things. Of course, not enough, but I do. And I can tell you a story. Deng Xiaoping and President Carter, were negotiating about the establishment of diplomatic relations, because after Nixon's visit, China and the U.S. still did not have diplomatic relations. That was eventually established when Deng Xiaoping came at the end of '78. But before that, there was a big discussion between Beijing and Washington, apparently. It's because Deng Xiaoping demanded that there is a stipulation in their agreement about the diplomatic relations that China would send many students over to the United States. I remember that one day I got a call from Frank Press, who was the president of the National Academy. And he said, I would like to come to Washington. We want to have a discussion about the Chinese students coming to America. So I went. And at the same meeting was Frank Press, myself, Sam Ting, and C.C. Ling. Sam Ting and C.C. Ling were both professors at MIT. And of course, Frank Press came from MIT, so naturally. And from the government side, there was Frank Press, but there was also Oxenberg. Oxenberg, at that time, was the China expert in the National Security Council. It was Oxenberg who asked the press to organize this. And the question was to review the history of Chinese students coming to America. And I remembered at one point I asked Oxenberg a direct question. I said, in your view, from the American side, what is the advantage to America of having Chinese students here? I was deeply impressed by what he said. He said there's a long history of Chinese students in America, starting, in fact, with the Boxer students that I mentioned earlier. He said that has produced a number of people who later become very important in China in various aspects of Chinese society, especially in education, but more than that. Of course, I immediately have Chou Peiyuan coming to mind. Chou Peiyuan was one of the early Boxer students. At the time of 1978, he was president of Peking University. He was my teacher also. So Oxenberg said that reviewing this history, we realized that these America-trained students had a profound influence on Chinese society. And now that generation is about at the end of their lives. And I believe, Oxenberg said he believes that it will be useful to create another generation of Chinese leaders. I was deeply impressed by this statement. And in fact, after that, in fact, the story is more complicated. Because after Deng Xiaoping proposed this, after it became come into effect, thousands of Chinese students came too. And Zhou Peiyuan himself, the president of Peking University, and many professors in China said, this is no good. This is a brain drain, because we have thousands of these students going to America, and most of them are not coming back. This is a pure brain drain. In retrospect, I think it testifies to the farsightedness of Deng Xiaoping. Because yes, many did not return to China, but some did return. And if you now today look at the important universities, the presidents of the important universities in China, I would say a majority of them were the people who came to America and spent maybe 5 or 10 years and returned to China. They are the leaders of Chinese higher education today. In other words, the people who came over here, indeed many did not go back, including my sister. My sister came around that time, and she did not go back. But there were enough people who went back. China is a big country, so these people produced results. But these were people who came who were in their 30s or 40s. So when they came, they are not like fresh graduate students. But beginning in the late 90s and in the 21st century, the Chinese students who come here are not like myself. When I got my bachelor's degree, I came here. And therefore, their learning experience in America is different. And in physics and mathematics, you can see that many of these are now becoming very good postdocs. And in fact, I have just heard that there's a group of 5 number theorists who is considered to be stars. And the center that I helped to found in Beijing, in Tsinghua University, has produced graduate students who have become postdocs. They are now extremely prominent in the condensed matter theory field. So I think that, and because of what I said earlier, I think that this exchange is extremely important for China and for America. In fact, for the future of the world.
When you went back to China, correct me if I'm wrong, but I had the sense that the country was there to welcome you. That you and Li, having won the first Nobel Prize for Chinese-born, or Chinese origin, meant something special to the country that may in itself reflect in some way on Chinese culture. Have you thought, is this speaking to anything that you've thought about? Why was China so responsive to you? Would it have been in another country the same way?
The answer is both obvious and deep. You know, the Chinese people were despised. If you read the newspaper, if you read the New York Times of 1900, you would understand that. Here's a huge country which is in a mess, and the people are starving. And when I was a child, almost every year there is a drought or a flood in some province at which millions of people died. Also, when I was a child, when these things happen, like a flood, the people from the peasants, the peasants would drift away from where they are. And I was born in Hefei. Hefei was a town of about 10,000, about 100,000 people. And when the flood comes, when these poor people came, they would camp in a square, and they would sell their daughters. You can buy a maid for a few dollars, and the maid become your property. You can treat her in whichever you want, except if you kill her. If you kill her, there might be some problems. But if you beat her, nobody would bash her eye. That is the state of China. And I told you, opium smoking was very common. Of course, the Western people would despise the Chinese. And when the Eight Power occupied Beijing, they had only a few thousand troops, and yet they were able to occupy Beijing, the capital of a huge empire. Why? Because China was down on her knees, and there was nothing that China could do. Against such a background, everybody realized that it is because China is so weak, among other things, it's because China has no modern science. So when Li and I got our Nobel Prize, it was something which was a national event. When I made that speech in Stockholm, this part I did not say, but I was heavy with that understanding. So one day, I think in the 90s, I was interviewed on radio in Hong Kong. And the interview, it was a rambling interview. And he suddenly asked me, what is your most important contribution in life? So I thought for a while and said, it is to help the Chinese people to overcome a deep feeling of inferiority complex. I still think that is the meaning of that Nobel Prize.